podcast. Thank you for joining us. It's March 28th, 2018. It's good to be back after some time off. So tonight I'm going to talk about adoption, and I'm going to talk more broadly about attachment theory and attachment and bonding. Although this is specific to adoption and specifically borrowed from a book entitled 20 Things Your Adopted Children Want Their Adopted Parents to Know, I think there's application to broader topics. Like always, we can learn as we listen to how other people navigate the challenges in their life. Even though they might be different than ours, we can take those away. I've been talking about that a lot with parents lately. About, for example, going into an Al-Anon meeting and listening to how other people, regardless of the relationship, regardless of what relationship it is, listen to how other people are dealing with somebody in their life that they love and care about that is participating in self-destructive behaviors. And so when we can begin to listen to the kind of thinking, the kind of sensibility that goes into that, navigating that, I think we can begin to really learn at a deeper level what's going on in our lives and how we can more effectively navigate ourselves through the challenges that we have. So with that, let me get right into it. Let's think about adoption at Evoke, about the way that we think about it at Evoke. First of all, it is a part or a time for adolescents and young adults to be looking at their identity. And so it's almost like you're just putting a magnifying glass on something like adoption. It's not created, the question isn't created during adolescence and young adulthood, but it is something that can be amplified during this period. Sometimes the identity is an absence of knowing what part of myself comes from my genetics, what part of myself comes from those who created me biologically in this process. What we do know is that adoption challenges can affect us at many different developmental stages. It's not kind of a one-size-fits-all. There are many different ways to internalize, to come up against the challenges that adoption present to individuals. And it doesn't matter if they were adopted into a wonderful, loving, stable family. Even in those conditions, there still can be questions about it. What's the meaning that they make out of it? I've had clients, students, who have longed to identify with the way that they look. Some of them, knowing something about their biological parents, have also identified with characteristics and traits that their biological parents had, even if those traits weren't positive. You know, is it a meaning of I was not loved, I was too much of a burden, if I was a good baby, if I had fewer needs? One of the most common qualities of shame that we know about in all of human behavior is something called shame of dependence. That if I need things, if I'm a needy person, if I have needs, that people are going to go away from me. And so sometimes adopted children, hearing that they were too much for even in the case of a teenage parent, that can be translated through their filter as, I need too much. The only way to assure that people aren't going to leave me is if I need. I talk about these stages of treatment often. These aren't always the case, but this was a common theme that I saw in the clients that I work with who were adopted. In the beginning stages, it was nothing. When I would ask the question about what their adoption had to do with anything that was going on in their life, they would often say nothing. And then oftentimes I would give them assignments like writing their biological parents a letter, and in most all cases that they would never necessarily send to them, but it was an exercise in working out that relationship. Or I would give them a book about adoption. Again, you're looking as a therapist in all the usual suspects, if you will, right? You don't know what are the events, the processes, the triggers that led to some of the behaviors, the issues that we're seeing today, but you kind of look in those places: marriage, conflict, learning differences, bullying, sexual identity, orientation, right? You start to just kind of go down the list and see if there's anything there that pops out. And so you give them a book to look at, to understand. And then it wouldn't be uncommon for an adolescent or a young adult to come back after a week or two of those kinds of assignments and saying it's everything. All of their groups, all of their discussions, because these assignments about adoption do so well to kind of frame the kind of development that a lot of these children are going through. And so the second stage would be, it's everything. Everything is about my adoption. And then where we get to eventually is it means something. It's a piece, it's a puzzle piece of the big picture. How big of a puzzle piece it is, we don't know. That'll be something that you'll figure out over the course of your life. You'll figure out the size and the shape of that piece and where it fits. Like I said, some of them are looking for connection. I have students who ask for, in cases where there are other adoptive children in the group or even staff, to have groups with just those children. That's not an uncommon thing. They're looking for some kind of connection. It's really not unlike one of the latest trends in some ways in our culture where people are going back and looking at their ancestry. I don't want to trivialize it because it's deeper and broader than that, but there is this longing for that connection. I know last year when I visited Ireland for the first time in my life, finding out through my own DNA test that all the stories I had heard were confirmed and were Irish, I remember feeling a kinship to everybody there. Even remember having my daughter say to me, "You look like everybody else here. You have a similar look to you, a similar coloring." And if ancestry can have that kind of an impact, imagine, of course, how much more profound it would be for somebody who doesn't know their own biological parents, the parents, the ancestors that are just one generation above them. While we look under the rocks, while we search for those things, remember this about therapy. Remember this about a voc therapy program. Remember this about any program that you send your child to. It's not about catching the fish. You know the old adage that you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Yes, we are good fishermen and women. We know how to fish. We know the bait to use. We know the hot spots to look at, to go to. But the fact of the matter is we're trying to teach children how to fish. And I say this to parents often. Unfortunately, I wish this weren't necessarily true, but the worst things the worst things that will happen in your child's life haven't necessarily happened yet, for most of them. The hardest, most difficult, uncomfortable, painful things haven't happened yet. So we want to provide them with tools to be able to make their way through life. And so we look back on divorce. We look back on several moves. We look back on if there was some kind of abuse. We look at those places to start to practice what it's like when some kind of trauma, some kind of break, fracture, and attachment occurred. And how did it affect you? How does it feel? And how are you medicating to deal with that, right? We look at that, but we're also thinking about the fact that this is something that's going to unfold over the course of their life. We want to teach them how to feel. That's the most basic way to understand the all of therapy, is you're teaching somebody how to feel and teaching them how to cope with it and giving them some practice at coping with it. It's important, of course, that it not be about you as the parent. I'm not a parent of adopted children, so I don't have a personal experience with it. I have my own children, of course, and there's similarities in some of the tasks and jobs of that role that I have. And in both, and in the case of adopted parents, it's really important that whatever it does to threaten you, to make you uncomfortable, that you take care of that yourself. Even the slightest inkling for many children that their parents might be threatened by or feel displaced by the exploration or the questions. Even the slightest inkling for a lot of children, they'll bury it. So it's very important that you do whatever work you need to do in those areas. So I want to share with you, I'm going to go over the concepts, the bullet points from the book 20 Things Adopted Kids Wish Their Adopted Parents Knew by Sherry Eldridge. I think it's a great way to touch on a lot of these concepts and principles. She separates them into several categories. So I'm going to go through the first category, which is communication issues related to the loss. First, and these are all spoken of in terms of the first person of the adopted child. I suffered a profound loss before I was adopted. You are not responsible. Again, you can hear in that I want to have both the ability to feel it and have it not be about you. No matter how wonderful you have done, no matter how generous you have been with your love, no matter how stable our life has been, I suffered a loss before you. And this loss that I suffered has nothing to do with you. Bullet point number 2, I need to be taught that I have special needs, including emotional, educational, validation, parental, relational, and spiritual needs arising from adoption loss, of which I will not be ashamed. Again, you can start to hear that need to be recognized and to be seen that all children have, and that adopted children have in these specific issues that are unique to them. They want to be seen for who they are, and they want to make their way through the shame of it all and not be ashamed of it. As is true with any child, this is really an important and broad topic I'm about to share. As is true with any child, when their needs become overwhelming or when we feel inadequate to meet the needs of a child, we can inadvertently shame them by suggesting that their needs are too much, inappropriate, irrational, nonsensical. They're being too sensitive or overreacting or melodramatic. It's important that we own our inadequacy. Again, like I always talk about, the foundation of Evoke's parent education, you've got to go and do your work, whatever it is, and we all have it, so that you can be most able to provide support for your child in this process, and it goes with this aspect. Number 3, if I don't grieve my loss, my ability to receive love from you and others will be hindered. Right? It's going to get in the way, and oftentimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, they'll take it out on people around them, specifically their parents. Right? Their grief will turn to anger if not processed and fully felt and honored. And so everybody that they come into contact with, that they form any kind of loving relationship, can be the target of rage and anger and distance and sabotage. Number 4, the author warns that to go with your child to this place of grieving requires courage as well as a willingness to do your own emotional work. Quote, we can't take others where we haven't first been ourselves. Their pain will frighten us away, unquote. Of course, this speaks to what I talk about all the time. If nothing else happens at Evoke Therapy programs, if nothing else happens to those of you who hear these podcasts, except that you realize and accept the invitation to do your own work, then I feel like I've succeeded. This isn't the end-all be-all. This is an invitation into doing your work. And it requires capacity. You know, I've heard so many adoptive parents say that they thought simply it was just going to be, if I loved my child, it would be enough. They didn't prepare me for all the work that it was going to take. And these children have special needs. So almost by definition of being an adopted parent, they should warn you and say you're going to need to go to therapy. You're going to need to have enough money to go to therapy, family or individual, to be able to provide for them in the special ways that they're asking. Number 5, my unresolved grief may surface in anger towards you. I spoke of that just a moment ago. I get that even in the field. I get a skepticism, a reservation, a sabotage from students sometimes who have attachment issues and specifically adoptive issues. Number 6, I need your help in grieving my loss. Teach me how to get in touch with my feelings about adoption and validate them. You know, in many ways, having a child at Evoke is one way that parents do that. Alice Miller said, a parent who is not necessarily capable of nurturing at times can still provide it for their child if only they allow that child to get it from somebody else. And in some respects, I think that's true of all of us. Right? There are things that other people can do for my children that I can't do myself. Doesn't mean that they love them as much or more than I do, but sometimes they can get it done. Number 7, just because I don't talk about my birth family doesn't mean I don't think about them. Eldridge talks about the fantasy life and idealizing. I think this one is one of the most common ones I've seen in my practice. That when we dig a little, when we pursue it a little, and again, all therapists are going to pursue it some, that it's not uncommon at all to find somebody who had a lot more thoughts and feelings underneath the surface that they never spoke, even though their adoptive parents would often say, we brought it up, we were open, we shared this bit of information or that bit of information. The child can often still be reserved in the process. Next, I want to take the initiative in talking about my birth family. Is it okay to ask, say, be angry, to search? Question haunts adoptees, and Eldridge tells us why. I think that that's something that sometimes gets misunderstood in my work as a wellness therapist, is that you've got to walk this balance between encouraging, supporting, facilitating somebody to explore something like the loss of adoption or being put up for adoption, and forcing it, taking it over. When something happens to us that we didn't have control over, and then somebody comes into our life like a therapist and takes control over the healing, the exploration, the discussion, it can feel invasive. It can be a recreation of the abuse. And so you balance it, right? You make invitation. You ask questions. You ask them to try it on for size. You feel where they're at, feel how ready they are. But you balance that with giving them some power back in the process, especially for the parent-child relationship. I need to know the truth about my conception, birth, and family history, no matter how painful the details may be. Regarding painful information about a child's past, Eldridge says this giving of information doesn't have so much to do with the truth about his past as it does with his relationship with you and with himself. Read more on that chapter if you have questions. Consult with your own therapist if you have questions, but this is her suggestion from her research that children want to know, even if the conception, the birth, the family history has some trauma in it. The next one, I'm afraid I was given away by my birth mother because I was a bad baby. I need you to help me dump my toxic shame. Like I said again, it's the neediness, right? The shame of dependence. That's common for all of us and more focused and amplified if somebody was put up for adoption. I'm afraid you will abandon me. That, I think, might seem irrational of both parents, right? The child from every conscious moment of their life knows me, the adoptive parent, as their child. But knowing about the adoption, knowing that they were put up for adoption, can leave in the mind this doubt that people can leave you. I may appear more whole than I actually am. I need your help to uncover parts of myself that I keep hidden so I can integrate all the elements of my identity. I think a lot of children that I've dealt with have this feature. They look more integrated, more whole. And they try to hold it together. Sometimes it's the shame that they try to hold it together, the fear of abandonment, right? For a lot of other reasons. Next, I need to gain a sense of personal power. Now, this is part of the work, is empowering them to take their story back, to explore it, and write it for themselves. Next one, please don't say I look like or act like you, just like you. I need you to acknowledge and celebrate our differences. Right? I think that's an important idea that we would think a lot of us would imagine that we would think about our saying those kinds of things as something that bonds us together. And Eldridge warns against that. That it can feel very dismissing. Again, it's a good example of not seeing the child. Let me be my own person, but don't let me cut myself off from you. I don't think that's been a problem for most of the families that I've worked with. They've fought to stay engaged, even when the child has tried to cut them off. Please respect my privacy regarding my adoption. Don't tell other people without my consent. Birthdays may be difficult for me. Birthdays are like what we call elevator days, regression days, right? The same way that for a lot of us, Thanksgiving or the December family holidays might be regression days, right? They bring us back, they remind us of earlier times in our life. And for the adopted child, it can be that remembrance, that celebration of their birth. Next, not knowing my full medical history can be distressing at times. I mean, that makes sense, right? But those of us who aren't adopted don't think about that necessarily. I'm afraid I'll be too much for you to handle. There's that shame. There's that shame of dependence. When I act out my fears in obnoxious ways, please hang in there with me and respond wisely. Eldridge includes advice on how to confront obnoxious behavior, so you can read that chapter to learn more. Another way of how they try to sabotage, create distance, and cut off. They're going to try to create a scenario where you will abandon them, where I will abandon them, where people will abandon them in their lives, to kind of play out this trauma over and over again and say, see, I was right. Eventually I'll be too much. And lastly, even if I decide to search for my birth family, I always want you to be my parents. And it takes some kind of confidence. I remember when somebody said to me earlier, I have 2 children from my first marriage. And somebody said to me early on in my life, when my children were starting to call their stepfather dad, and I went to a mentor and I talked about how horrible and scary that felt to me. And my mentor said to me, you'll always be what you'll always be to them. The name that they call you won't matter. And it was incredibly relieving. And now they're 23 and 25 years old, and it's played out to be that we have an incredibly close relationship, a special relationship that wasn't at all affected by what they called anybody else. And I play a role in their life that nobody else can play. Let's talk about attachment and bonding. Attachment is an emotional bond to another person. Psychologist John Bowlby was the first attachment theorist, describing attachment as a, quote, lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. Attachment, folks, more broadly than just with adopted children, is the most important thing that we can do. It's why I talk so much about doing your own work, because that lays the groundwork, the foundation to be able to provide, to be able to create healthy attachment with your child. In the book, if you want to learn more about that, read the book Parenting from the Inside Out by Daniel Siegel and Mary Hartzell. My book talks about this. My book is based on attachment theory. It is, if I'm grounded, if I'm okay, if I'm a secure base, then my child has a safe place to go back to. Feels safe, can explore the world. The characteristics of attachment. First, a safe haven. When the child feels threatened or afraid, he or she can return to the caregiver for comfort and soothing. Number 2, a secure base. The caregiver provides a secure and dependable base for the child to explore the world. Number 3, proximity maintenance. The child strives to stay near the caregiver, thus helping keep the child safe. These are early childhood moments. And then lastly, separation distress. When separated from the caregiver, the child will become upset and distressed. It's as children grow to adolescence, it's not about proximity, right? It's about the quality of relationship. You can improve the quality of attachment with your child during your time at Evoke as you do your work, as you learn to respond in a curious way, a non-anxious way, a non-frustrated or angry way, you can improve the attachment even though you might be hundreds or thousands of miles apart. When parents say, we connected more through letters, or I saw them, or they saw me more clearly, or we had a better relationship, they're describing that improvement. The distance, the communication through letters provides that for families often. I'll talk about different qualities of attachment. Secure attachment. Secure attachment, securely attached children exhibit minimal distress when separated from caregivers. Remember, these children feel secure and able to depend upon their adult caregivers. When the adult leaves, the child feels assured that the parent or caregiver will return. When frightened, securely attached children will seek comfort from caregivers. These children know their parent or caregiver will provide comfort and reassurance, so they are comfortable seeking them out in times of need. This is specifically related to young children, but in a sense, this is what I talk about when I say you want to be the first call with your young adult or adolescent child. When your young adult or adolescent child is going through stress, you would like to qualify to be their safe person. I say this in parent meetings all the time. I hope it translates on the webinar and on the podcast, but if your child comes to you and shares something that they're going through that's difficult or scary, and your response is a gasp like, immediately the child knows that you're not safe. If you attempt to control, to micromanage, you get angry or frustrated, all of those are indications of a break or a fracture in attachment, in connection. So you do your work, you take care of your anxiety in your meetings with your therapist, so that when your child comes to you, you can be a more whole and complete person for them. Parents who have unresolved trauma, who are reactive, who are anxious, who exhibit control, anger, frustration, they are fundamentally less capable of providing an environment optimal for secure attachment. And secure attachment is the number one contributing factor in resiliency. You can develop what they call earned attachment. This is not forever lost. It's hard to make it up, but you can develop an earned attachment as an adult or as a young adult or adolescent. You can develop a healthier attachment. We call it earned attachment by doing your own work also. But you need somebody who cares. You need somebody in your life. You can't do it on your own. Characteristics of ambivalent attachment. Ambivalently attached children usually become very distressed when a parent leaves. This attachment style is considered relatively uncommon, affecting an estimated 7 to 15% of U.S. children. Research suggests that ambivalent attachment is a result of poor maternal availability. These children cannot depend upon their mother or caregiver to be there when the child is in need. Right? It makes sense. They could be distracted. I've seen people that are carrying so much around their own trauma, they just don't seem present with their child. It's like they're numb. Right? This is where we talk about intergenerational transmission of trauma. If you're walking around preoccupied, hypervigilant, in your own head, not present, to whatever degree, you could be potentially contributing to this kind of attachment. And then avoidant attachment. Children with avoidant attachment tend to avoid parents or caregivers. When offered a choice, these children will show no preference between a caregiver or a complete stranger. Research has suggested that this attachment style might be the result of abusive or neglectful caregivers. Children who are punished for relying on a caregiver will learn to avoid seeking one. Right? Sometimes it's funny, I've seen people describe these kinds of children as well developed, right? They can walk up to strangers. They're just as likely to go into the arms of a stranger as they are their parent. The insidious idea is that in the case of these children, these avoidant attachment children, they're being rewarded for not needing and stressing out the parent, right? They're being rewarded for having an avoidant attachment style. Somebody who is a professional in our field, an adoptive parent that I respect, an educator at an Ivy League school, shared some thoughts with me to share with you. He said, the most important point, I believe, is this. When your child expresses anger to you, the adoptive parent, the child is typically trying to deal with the hurt they feel towards their biological parent who abandoned them. Also, when the child is expressing anger and hurting you, the adoptive parent, he or she may be trying to connect with you in the only way that she knows how to. For example, making you feel as bad as the child. It's a primitive form of communication. Another major point is that many adoptive parents believe that loving the child with all of your heart is enough to undo whatever problems the child might have. The fact is that love is not enough. This is true for all of us. Love is not enough. That the issues the child has have their roots in the prior to the adoption itself. For example, to the initial abandonment, and therefore have nothing to do with the adoptive parent. I think a lot of parents, because of their own shame and guilt, they feel like a child who's struggling with this issue of adoption, grief, and loss, or other issues, feel like it's an indictment on them, on how much they love their child. And I hope that that last slide can offer to you the idea that it's not that simple. And that sometimes the work that you do at Evoke, the work that you do around these kinds of interventions, is evidence of a more powerful form of love, a more powerful form of capacity that we call love. I want to tell you one thing, going back to the attachment styles, it's fascinating. I've shared this one or two other times, but since we're talking about attachment tonight, I want to share this study with you. I attended a seminar last year and a couple of years ago where the same professor from Columbia spoke, an attachment theorist. And her name is Dr. Nim Tottenham. And she shared one study in their laboratory where they took baby rats, right? Baby pups, rats. And they shocked them. They gave them an unpleasant shock. They separated the rats into two groups. Half of the rats were put by themselves in isolation and shocked. And then that shock was paired with a puff of peppermint odor, peppermint smell. They took the other half of the subjects, the baby pup rats, and they put them with their mothers. And they shocked them just the same. And they paired the shocking with the same peppermint smell, right? So they paired the peppermint smell. Some rats were alone, some rats were with their mother. Then later on, when the pups were older, grown up a bit, they put them in mazes. And in these mazes, there were tubes that would go to different odors. There was a peppermint smell. There was a citrus smell. There was a pine smell. There was a neutral smell, right? They put them in these different mazes. Nearly all of the rats shocked by themselves avoided the peppermint tube. Nearly all the rats who were shocked while they were paired with their mothers, while they were sitting with their mothers, went toward the peppermint smell. Fascinating study. The idea in that is that the kind of attachment that we have in our childhood trumps even the trauma. In other words, if we have an environment that produces ambivalent attachment, we're going to be attracted to those kinds of environment. If we have an environment where there's avoidant attachment, we're going to be attracted toward that. If we have certain qualities of trauma in our family, we're going to be attracted to what we feel comfortable with, because attachment style trumps everything. Fascinating outcome. What are the take-homes from tonight's broadcast? Providing a secure base requires you to do your work and resolve, to some degree, your trauma. The most foundational idea in our curriculum. The adoption issues your child is working on working through are not about you. That, again, takes a capacity to do your own work and to separate yourself so that you can be a safe base, a safe place, the first call. Adoption isn't everything, and it isn't nothing, but it is something. And it's the child's job to sort that out and figure out how it fits. Even if your child isn't talking about it, it doesn't mean that they're not thinking about it. Again, back to that idea that Eldridge talks about, that there's this, oftentimes, this fantasy world and ideal world that they think about. Attachment is the most important ingredient in the development of resiliency. We've talked about that plenty tonight. Adoption and attachment fractures affect children in different ways according to the developmental stages and other individual differences. So not everybody has the same symptomology, the same outcomes, the same diagnoses. And lastly, in order to take someone where they need to go, you need to have been there. Have to have the depth needed to contain their pain. I'm happy to take any live questions on the topic. If there are no questions, I'll go to upcoming events and then we'll come back to questions. We would like all families to try 6 12-step support groups while you're with us. Again, this is what I said earlier. Go to a meeting where you listen to other people, talk about how they're dealing with being related to a loved one who's struggling. Just listen to how they think, how they cope with it. On social media, follow us on our podcast. If you have an iPhone, go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app, or you can go to soundcloud.com on any computer and search Evoke Therapy Programs there. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, you can search Evoke Therapy Programs, hear about announcements. The other night, we did a live stream of a meeting. I spoke to a school in California. If you want to become involved in the Evoke Family Foundation on Facebook, this is an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy, raising money, providing scholarships. And then, of course, our Evoke Therapy blog has new content posted constantly. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. As of airing of this broadcast, it's currently out of stock. You can either buy it, it'll be sent to you when it comes in stock, or buy a Kindle or an audio version, or if you go to other options for buying, you can buy it from Evoke Therapy Programs there. Same price. Our upcoming workshops, if you can come to a workshop, multifamily, educational, experiential workshop. Our next one is at Entrada, April 21st. We want all current parents, if they're able to come to one of these workshops while their child is with us. You should talk to your Evoke therapist to see if the timing of that workshop can be combined with a field visit to visit your child. Our next intensive is May 9th through 13th, so get on that soon. If you want to do deeper work, some of the kind of work that I talked about tonight, this is a great springboard or a great accelerator. The next one is in May 9th through 13th. You can also schedule a private family intensive. We also, if there are professionals listening to this, because we have professionals listening on the podcast, if you're a professional and you want to attend a professional growth workshop, doing some of your own work as it relates to being in the field of mental health and addiction treatment, we have a couple coming up. The May 6th through 8th may be full as of now, but you can also email us at intensives@evoketherapy.com to ask more. We have a women's one with a spot on May 20th through 22nd. Any questions, you can go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Our upcoming parent support groups, Portland, Oregon, Saturday, March 31st, 4 to 6 p.m., Courtyard, Portland, downtown. In New York City, I'll be back there Monday, April 23rd, 7 to 9 p.m. at the City University of New York in Midtown. In Seattle on June 2nd, 4 to 6 p.m., and then we have others coming up. Email Andrea@evoketherapy.com for more questions or to RSVP. If you want to do an adventure trip with your family, or if you're a young adult, if you want some sober fun, therapy light, a reconnection, look at our website under the Pursuits program. Any live questions come in? one question. How does one get a therapist to help them become a safe base refuge? I actually did a podcast webinar recently on what to look for in a therapist. I also have a blog on what to look for in a therapist. Go to drbradreedy.com and look there. So you be a consumer, be a customer, be someone there that can contain you. So a couple of the blogs that I wrote is what to look for in a therapist, the myth of the guru therapist is another one, and the myth of therapy is another one. So yeah, those are some blogs that I've written specific to that, and more recently I did a podcast on it, a webinar on it. You can look at that. That can help you more, but somebody that can see you, somebody that can find you. All right, no other questions. Thank you so much for the group that joined us this evening. For and on behalf of your child, I thank you for being willing to do your work. The next webinar broadcast, next broadcast will be tomorrow evening, Thursday, March 29th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and that's on immersion. It's a little bit more fun. We're going to be talking about the principles, the jargon, and the culture, and what it's like to be immersed in the culture of evoked therapy programs. Have a great 24 hours, folks, and I'll talk to you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.